Chapter 2. Jedi Knight Kinsa Una held her head in her hands, softly massaging her temples, breathing deeply and clearing her mind. She had spent 2 long, dreary days meditating between 3 tribes of Barab 1. Finally, today, she could get on with her mission and search for Force-sensitive children to be taken back to Coruscant for Jedi training. As Kinsa walked the dark, slightly damp hallways to the meeting cave, she heard a loud argument brewing within. She stepped into the dimly lit room, and she sighed inwardly while putting on a mask of calm interest. 3 gigantic men, heads of their tribes, were in the middle of a heated discussion, talking about a problem it would of course be up to Kinsa to fix. She remembered how surprised she had been when she had first seen a Barabel, and their size still surprised her whenever she saw them. They stood about 2 meters tall, the backs of the Endor tribe usually even taller, when they were covered head to toe in thick scales and had a long tail that could be worked independently like a limb. These ones were dressed in ceremonial robes similar to the traditional garb of the Jedi, with just a tad more color. On normal occasions, however, Barabel men wore simple pants and rarely ever donned a shirt. In fact, one of the only ways an outsider could differentiate between the males and females of the species was that the females always covered their torsos with a shirt or some other garb. They had wide mouths stuffed with thin, razor-sharp teeth. It seemed to Kinsa that there were about twice as many teeth as would fit comfortably. Unlike most reptilian species, they had 4 fingers and opposing thumb instead of just having fingers. At the end of each of their digits, they had long, retractable claws. There was very little difference besides color between the 3 tribes. The black-scaled Endor were the tallest and thickest of the 3 tribes, and had historically controlled the majority of the forest. The red-colored Boondal considered themselves to be the smartest, but actually were just the most nervous, being the smallest of the 3 tribes in stature, occasionally falling below 2 meters. The gray-skinned Hostar fell between the other 2 in size, and had significantly smaller population than the others. To Kinsa, it seemed that they were the smartest, the middle child playing one tribe off the other, controlling a large part of the forest, being so small in population. Despite the fact that they were all the same species and followed the same customs, there was constant strife between the tribes. Constant border disagreements were always close to igniting war between the tribes. Besides this summit, mediated by a Jedi, there was little to no contact between the tribes that didn't end in blood. "Is there a problem, gentlemen?" "Yes, there is," announced the red-skinned Boondal representative, Marg. He spoke in the halting, hissing basic she had gotten used to over the past couple days. "Another one of our hunters has gone missing, and I suspect it was Rogan." "The blight of the Barabel," spat Durgan, the black Endor leader. The gray diplomat, Orin, gave a scoff of disbelief and dismissal. "Your green hunter just tried to take on something he couldn't kill. Not every problem can be blamed on one renegade." "4 in a row, maybe even 5. You say all of this is just a coincidence?" Marg shot back angrily. "I'm sure if he was still doing his killing in your forest, you wouldn't be blaming it on hunting." Orin shrugged his shoulders, admitting defeat, but Kinsa thought she heard him mumble something under his breath. "Who is Rogan?" inquired Kinsa. He is a young Barabel of the Endor tribe who ran away just over a year ago and has killed every Barabel he has come across since," explained the Endor chief in a quiet voice, refusing to look at Kinsa in the eye. "And he is Force-sensitive," Marg chimed in. "He's 19 and he escapes notice, I'm sure, but I'm sure he controls the Force. He ran away and killed one of his own tribe on the day this was discovered," the hulking Durgan responded darkly, his head still bent. While it was normal for a Barabel to kill another Barabel, Kinsa knew killing one of your own tribe was seen as the greatest offense. "Why didn't you mention this before?" Kinsa asked, rising to her feet, her anger clear in her voice. "I need to go now. Where is he?" Somewhere in the Boondall Forest, no one knows exactly where, stated the Black Durgan, standing slowly. If you're planning on going after him, you need a guide. I shall join you. Kinsa hesitated. Okay, but when we find him, you need to back off. The Endor looked up at her for the first time, and she saw the dark rage in his smoky gray eyes. As you wish, he snarled unconvincingly. Kinsa doubted the man's words, but she had no choice. There was no way she could traverse the jungle at night alone. I'm coming too, the Red Chief exclaimed, leaping to his feet. It's my forest. Kinsa nodded her begrudging agreement. She just wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. Scene change. Rogan rose at the same time he always did, 20 minutes before the sun went down, just before the time to hunt. He slowly arose from the hard stone floor, his spine stretching and popping. As he prepared to go out again, he grabbed his large broadsword and strapped it to his back. It wouldn't be good against his prey, but if he came across another hunter, it could come in handy. His stomach growled, demanding to be fed again. The Haroni was already digested. He reached for the dried meat he kept in reserve. He grabbed a few dried slices of meat and wolfed it down quickly. He truly hated this desperate existence, living alone with no reason to get up, except to continue his survival. Before, when he was living with his clan, he was coming to the age where he could have started searching for a mate and really start a life for himself. But it had all been thrown away. Now he was living alone in a tiny hole barely big enough to be called a cave, doing nothing with his life but surviving. No matter how he felt about his current existence, he wasn't about to stop living. He switched to infrared vision as the sun went down and stood in the entrance of the cave looking out. As the last of the harsh poisonous rays disappeared over the horizon, leaving the world to the oppressive, beautiful darkness. Scene change. Kinsa was following behind the two massive barbels, stalking slowly in the dark, murky forest. The darkness was so thick and oppressive she could hardly see the bodies of her guides. It felt as if there was a constant cloud of bugs swarming around her, following her every move. At first she'd attempted to keep them at bay, but no matter what she did, they clung to her clammy skin. Swatting the cloud of bugs she could feel but not see had also taken her focus. Multiple times she had stumbled over the large roots, jutting up from the soft dirt. She made a mental note to start bringing night vision goggles on her missions in the future. She could have used a glow rod to light the way, but they didn't want to alert Rogan to their presence before they found him. She was certain the barbels were moving slower for her sake. Their infrared eyes would have no problem navigating the thick forest. They had been looking for hours, and everyone knew they would have to turn back soon, but no one had mentioned it so far. As they trudged along, Kinsa couldn't calm down, her hand unconsciously drifting toward the hilt of her lightsaber. It had been so long since she had been in a real combat situation, and the very idea of it made her skin shiver with nervousness and, admittedly, excitement. Only a few minutes more of the slow, miserable march, and she sensed a feeling of evil begin to spread through the air. She kept silent about it, not sure if it was real, and not wanting to give false hope. As I continued to walk forward, the dark feeling she felt grew stronger, letting her know they were headed in the right way. She drew, but didn't ignite her saber. She didn't want noise or light to draw attention, but she felt the need to be ready. The barbels saw her, ready her lightsaber, and got the hint, pulling out their weapons as well. As the feeling continued to grow thicker, she sped up and took lead of the group. Before she made it far, the black-scaled Durgan grabbed her shoulder and spun Kinsa around, motioning silently with his eyes. Kinsa understood the gesture. She was a human, and her eyes weren't accustomed to the dark like the barbels, with their dual-purpose eyes. She nodded and let him retake the lead. They, however, could not feel the pull of the Force, so, in hushed whispers, she directed the barbels as they scanned the trees. The darkness, she felt, grew more oppressive, and she suddenly tripped, falling forward and landing on a hard lump protruding from the ground. As she pushed herself back to her feet, she ignited her lightsaber in a slight panic, causing a pale yellow light over the large, twisted gray body. The barbells quickly took out and snapped their glow rods, everyone immediately wishing they hadn't. Kinsa counted 7 bodies strewn about, all battered and broken. Anger began to claw at her heart, but Kinsa held it at bay with calm, reciting the Jedi code under her breath. Beside the bodies, there was a large cave opening. She was about to continue into the hollow, but as she turned to look for her companions, she saw the Boondall on his knees in front of the red bodies. His chin was pointing to the sky, and his fingers covered his eyes as he whispered under his breath, too softly to hear. The Endor stood, his head bent slightly, paying some respect for the dead, but clearly not really caring at all. After all, it wasn't his tribe. Kinsa stood patiently, contemplating their next move as the Barbell gave peace to his brothers. Scene change. Cognis smiled as she approached her Y-class, long-range personal cruiser. It was dark, silver, sleek, T-shaped vessel. Since buying it, she'd had it heavily modified to fit her purposes. She had stripped away most of the armor to make it even more lightweight, and put in stronger thrusters to give it more maneuverability. She'd added extra weapons and put in the best hyperdrive generator and ion engine money could buy. As much as she loved her ship, which she had dubbed Raven, she knew that it would stand out and attract unwanted attention in a poor world like Alcaro. She instead stepped into her larger, less assuming transport ship. It was an old Republic shuttle ship that had been used to bring a low-level government employee from planet to planet. The outside of the ship was battered and rusty. It didn't look like it would still be flying by the end of the year. Despite its worn look, it was also heavily modified, just not in a way that could be seen by the untrained eye. She had installed a newer hyperdrive generator, though it wasn't as good as Raven's. The ship wasn't meant for speed. Also, unlike the Raven, she had added more armor, though the new plating could only be seen from the inside. The extra guns she had installed were held inside the ship and could only be seen when they were activated. While the Raven could fly circles around any ship, striking and fleeing before you even knew what hit them, this beast could go toe-to-toe with a medium-sized battlecruiser. If her maps and estimations were correct, she should be able to get to Alcaro in 3 or 4 days at most, as long as she didn't come across any trouble. Scene change. Barbells didn't often smile, and Rogan couldn't remember the last time he had a reason to, but he certainly had one now. This had been the most successful hunt since he'd left his home. He had needed to construct a makeshift raft from a dead tree and thick vines that he pulled along behind him in order to fit 5 animals he had caught. This amount of food would last him weeks. He had spent longer than he planned out of his cave every time he was about to turn in. He saw another opportunity. The first drizzles of the coming rain had just started to fall, but he was close enough to his cave now to get back even in a full-blown storm. His thoughts, which had been drifting toward cooking and preserving meat, were suddenly infiltrated by a sharp alarm warning him of danger. He quietly let the sled drop, careful not to make any sounds. He stalked forward carefully. He could see the mouth of his cave now and felt a sickness rising in the pit of his chest. Jedi. Rogan growled involuntarily and drew his sword from his back, letting the tip drag along the ground as he walked. He knew sound didn't matter at this point, figuring if he could feel the intruder, the Jedi would already know he was coming. Scene change. After lying in wait for hours, Kinsa finally picked up the signature of the Force user. She could tell that the power emanating from the unseen man, while strong, was wild and unrefined. This fight would end quickly. Scene change. Rogan abandoned his slow walk and sprinted into his cave, his sword hanging low in one hand, screaming with rage as he entered. He saw 3 invaders grouped together in his cave, 2 barbells at the back and 1 warm-blooded female in the front. She was an alien whose species he didn't recognize. She was small and shapely and looked to be about 1 meter and 70 or 80 centimeters tall. and couldn't weigh more than 57 kilograms. She had 2 long tendrils that protruded from the back of her head and hung behind her like 2 thick braids of hair. She was holding a sword with a thin blade that shone bright white with the heat in his infrared vision. From the stories told around campfires, he recognized this as the near mythical lightsaber, a weapon of both Sith and Jedi. Seeing him, the Barbells redrew their weapons as well. One had a large broadsword similar to his, and the other fumbled with an attempt to pull a large blaster rifle from his back, struggling because of the low ceiling in Rogan's small cave. Before they could attack, Rogan swept his free hand across, gathering the force into a broad, invisible wall, aimed to push the attackers away. As the Jedi brought her hand up to defend against his basic attack, the Barbells were lifted off their feet and crashed into the rock, collapsing in a heap, both of them unconscious. He immediately followed his attack up by swinging his sword an upward arc toward the alien who had blocked his force push. The female Jedi quickly brought her block up under her chin, but Rogan knew the defense was rushed and at a bad angle. The weight behind his attack would force the smaller woman to take a step back, and her small sword would be blown away, leaving her exposed. This would open her up to a diagonal downward strike that she couldn't hope to stop. Only none of that happened. As he swung his sword up, instead of meeting and breaking through the Jedi's defenses, his sword flew effortlessly past her blade. He was so surprised that the hilt of his sword almost flew out of his grasp as his arm swung up. He quickly jumped back, trying to give himself room to figure out what had happened. He heard a sharp clang and looked down to see the top of his blade clatter to the ground. He pushed away his sadness at losing and his most important possession. He didn't have time for sentimentality. He didn't know how, but the glowing lightsaber had cut through his sword, rendering it useless. Before the Jedi intruder could push her sudden advantage, Rogan gripped the hilt and threw the remaining half of his sword at her face. It flew end over end at her, but she easily deflected it to the side with a force. Though she had dealt with that easily enough, Rogan knew she was unprepared for the follow-up attack. Perspective change. As soon as the hilt left his hands, the amazingly gigantic Barbell flew forward and tackled her to the ground. Where Kinta's lightsaber and greater command over the Force would be less of an advantage, his shoulder drove into her stomach, and she gasped as the air was forced from her lungs. Kinta could hardly move or breathe, with the gigantic weight pressing down on her. The back of her head slammed hard onto the craggy floor, stabbing into her soft leku, the long protrusions that contained parts of her brain. Blinding pain filled her head, blocking out all other sensations outside of the short spasm of agony. As quickly as it had come, the burning warning disappeared, allowing her to come back to existence. The monstrous man sat down on her chest and rained punches down on her. She didn't even know how many had hit before now. She grunted and tried to bring her arms up to protect her face, but found that the Barbell had somehow managed to pin them at her side underneath him. Kinta started moving from side to side, trying to avoid the beast's rock-hard fist and possibly squirm out from under him, either by simple luck or some force occurrence. No matter how much she moved, he always seemed to strike her square in the face. After the paralyzing torment of having her head tails bruised, even the forceful punches of this monster seemed dull. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see 2 Barbell guides intertwined in an unconscious heap. They clearly wouldn't be any help. Her thoughts were ripped away when a particularly sharp punch slammed into her forehead, breaking the skin. If she weren't still conscious, she would have sworn it had dented her skull. This was starting to feel less dull. Perspective change. His scaled fist drove again and again into the Jedi's soft face, cutting through her skin. He felt his fists breaking her teeth, and he saw her mouth filling up with blood. Rogan slammed into her eye, and a small cut opened up. He punched in the same spot again, and became a deep laceration above the Jedi's left eye. She let out a brutal scream, and before he could revel in her suffering, Rogan suddenly felt himself being lifted up off the Jedi. For a short moment, he thought one of the two men he'd knocked unconscious had awakened, and he quickly realized the pressure was coming from under him, not above him. He flew up for a moment, and before he could understand what was going on, his ascendance was halted. The back of his head slammed into a long, thin stalactite hanging from the ceiling. If not for his natural armor-like scales, the stalactite would have pierced through his head and killed him instantly. As it was, the sharp stalactite snapped, and Rogan lost consciousness. Perspective change. Kinsa had almost passed out from the pain, and was now wiping the blood from her eyes, trying to clear her vision. She looked up with still blurry vision to see a large, black form racing down toward her. Before he smashed into her, she held her hands up and slowed the man's descent to stop. She held him there for a moment, studying the man's face, only a foot above her. His face seemed so much more peaceful, at rest, in comparison to the hungry rage that had been painted across his features earlier. To her untrained eyes, he looked exactly the same as any other Barabel, a large, wide nose, leading to a thin, almost invisible bridge. A thick, prominent ridge over his eyes was, like the rest of him, devoid of any hair. Scales larger than the ones on the rest of his body covered his bald head. Done looking over him, she moved the giant body to the side and let him drop softly to the floor. Kinsa slowly sat up, her head pounding, the gravity causing blood to once again pour from the fresh gash and drip into her eyes. She tasted blood in her mouth and spat, a couple of her sharp teeth coming out along with a stream of blood. With her one eye closed, she looked around the cave and saw her still unconscious companions. She tried to stand up, but felt a sharp stabbing in her lower chest as she moved. She pressed her fingers softly against her ribcage, and knew she had at least 2 broken ribs. She could tell by the pain she felt, and the blood that filtered into her mouth, that her nose was broken. She had been correct in saying that the fight would be over quickly, but it had been far messier than she had anticipated. Perspective change. "We're not going to kill him," Kinsa said, for what felt like the 10th time, accentuating her point by slamming her palm down on the stone table. The 3 men stopped their argument and glared at her. Kinsa had always heard that Barabels held opinions of Jedi in the highest respect, a holdover from an ancient time when a group of Jedi had crash-landed on the planet and ended up settling the Barabel War, a terrible conflict that had threatened to engulf the entire planet. It seemed to her that this must be an old and long-forgotten tradition. "It's none of your business and none of your concern, you weir," Marg spat at her, using the Barabel word for outsider, depending on the translation, unclean. "You are the one who has no right to an opinion here," Durgan yelled, towering threateningly over the smaller man. "He is not your tribe, and he did not abandon your people." "Was of your tribe, you mean. As you said, he abandoned your people, thus becoming an outcast and leaving your influence. He was found in my forest. He was captured in my forest, and the last person he killed was one of my people. It is our right to punish the derelict. When you exiled the worm, you lost all rights. And by that the Greys would have equal right to execute the animal. Has he not also had his voice butchered by the blight of the Barbel?" Durgan continued, his voice steadily mounting. Kinsa saw Marg slowly reach for the large knife he kept strapped to his side as Durgan continued to press into him. Orin, as always, kept silent. Though he had stood from his seat, Kinsa assumed he was getting ready to either fight or run in case something started. It was quite clear to her that they had once again gone back to ignoring her, truly believing that because she wasn't a Barbell, she shouldn't have any say in his fate. Not that his fate was up for debate. No matter who he went to, this Rogan would end up dead. They were simply fighting over who got to do the deed. As a Jedi, there was no way she would allow the bound and currently unconscious prisoner to be executed, no matter what she had done. She loathed the idea of starting a fight over this, but she had thought she had another idea of how to end the argument. Combat! She yelled out, breaking the angry glares between Marg and Durgan, and causing them to look at her curiously. I claim control of the prisoner by right of combat. It was I who defeated him, I who took the bruises to capture him, she gestured with her eyes to her various bandages and cuts. I subdued the man, and I shall decide what becomes of him, no one else. She finished her short speech off with an angry, daring look, as she placed her hand suggestively on her lightsaber. While she didn't actually plan on using the weapon, she needed to show that she wasn't afraid to defend her claim. She was met with complete silence, Orin staring at her with a measure of surprise and respect, while the other two only faced her with shocked rage. By their still faces and twitching fingers, she could tell that they were both waiting for the other to issue a challenge. No doubt they planned to challenge whoever the winner once they were tired and bruised. To be honest, Kinsa, tired and injured as she was, wasn't even sure if she could take on one of the men, never mind two, at least not without just killing them, which would defeat the purpose. Eventually, the stalemate went on long enough that Kinsa relaxed her pose, believing it had been decided. She bowed low to the men, still staring at her angrily, and left the council room, making the long trek to where they had kept the prisoner. As she walked, she considered what she would do with the man now that she had control over his future. The logical choice would be simply to bring him back to Coruscant and report him to the Jedi Council. They would congratulate her and would most likely be questioned for a short time before he was dropped onto one of the many prison wards. Though she knew this was what she should do with him, her mind kept coming up with other ideas.